Alrighty, y'all. So we're starting Unit 5 now. So we're getting close to the end. Unit 5, we're looking at factor markets. And if we think back to those factors of production, the acronym CEL, capital, entrepreneurship, land, labor, it's what goes into making a product. If we're looking at the difference between the factor market and the product market, the key difference is that the factor market, we're looking at buying and selling the inputs, right? It could be the labor market or it could be the resource market. The product market is looking at buying the outputs. So if I'm buying a house or a car, I'm looking at the product market. I'm looking at buying that finished good. So the factor market, we're looking at the what goes into making a product. The product market, we're looking at the output or the quantity. Our four-factor production, just as a reminder from Unit 1, are capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor. So these are the factors that go into making a product. The labor are the people doing the task to create it. The land resources are the natural resources. Capital is the tool that we're using. And entrepreneurs are the ones that bring all of these together. If I open up a pizza restaurant, I'm going to have to choose the ingredients, the tomatoes, the cheese, the dough. I'm hiring the workers. I'm getting them the equipment that they need. Now, if we're looking at these factor payments, there's a way to make money off of all of these, right? So when we're looking at capital to start out with, we call that interest. So if I am renting out some machinery, the money that I get off of that machinery I would call interest. Entrepreneurs, they make a profit, right? If I open up a business, my expectation is that I'm going to make a profit out of that. Labor would be our wages. That's probably the one we're most familiar with. And then land would be rent, which makes sense if I'm renting like a home or like an apartment from you. But if we're selling, like, let's say eggs, we'd still call that rent, which is kind of strange, but that's what we'd call that factor payment. Now, derived demand is when our demand for a resource goes up. So I'm going to put the demand for the resource goes up when the demand for a product goes up. So what I mean by that is, let's say that the demand for cars goes up. So the demand for that product is going up. Well, then the demand for the resources used to make it would go up as well. The iron, the aluminum, the steel, the demand for those resources would go up because they're derived from the product itself. If the demand for pizza goes up, the demand for cooks would go up. The demand for dough, the demand for tomatoes, the demand for cheese would go up. So that would be our derived demand, the resources that are derived from that product. Now, if we're looking at our supply and demand of labor, our supply is still upward sloping and our demand is downward sloping. If we're looking at labor in particular, the demand for labor is going to go downwards because businesses don't want expensive workers. If I'm looking at McDonald's demand for workers, they might be willing to hire 10 people at minimum wage, but maybe only 8 people at $10 an hour, or maybe only 6 people at $12 an hour, right? That their demand for labor is going to be downward sloping because the more expensive these workers are, the less willing they are to hire them. But if we're looking at why our supply of labor is upward sloping, it's for the opposite reason, right? That more workers are willing to work at a higher wage. So, if we're looking at price and quantity again, like any other supply or demand curve, as wages go up, that's our price there, the quantity of workers are going to go up as well, right? If we're looking at mowing a lawn, not many people would do it for free. Some people would do it for 10. A bunch of people would do it for 20. I think most people would do it for $100. The quantity is going to go up as the price goes up. So if we're looking at the supply and demand curve for labor and wages, it's not going to look that different than what we've been doing this whole time. So give me 1 second. We've got our wages on the y-axis. We've got our quantity of labor on the x-axis. Our supply is going to go up because as wages increase, our supply of workers are going to increase, and our demand is going to go down. And then at the middle, we have our equilibrium wages. So I'm going to put WE for equilibrium wage and QE for equilibrium quantity there. So assume that the government establishes a certification process that makes it harder to be a plumber. So we've got our market for plumbers here. Show what would happen to the graph. So if we're looking at this certification process, so that's how people become plumbers. If they're making it harder, then I think that would affect our supply of plumbers. It doesn't affect how much we need these plumbers, but it would affect how many we have. If it's more complicated to become a plumber, fewer people are going to do it at each wage. So our supply of plumbers would decrease. If we're looking at this demand for labor here, some of the big factors that we're looking at, sorry, give me 1 minute. Comes back to that derived demand. So the demand for the product is going to affect it. So if, let's say the demand for iPods goes down, the demand for those workers are going to decrease as well. The same way that the demand for frozen yogurt was high for about a decade, but it kind of dropped off. All of those places closed down, and so our demand for those workers has decreased as well. So the price for alternatives. So let's say that we're looking at assembly line workers, right? If the price of new robots decreases, then the demand for our laborers are going to decrease as well, because people are more likely to buy the robots and less likely to buy or hire the workers. And the other price of inputs, right? So if I'm looking at a factory that makes cars, and the price of tools goes up and the price of resources goes up, that's going to eat up more of those businesses' budgets. I think the demand for labor would decline there. If we're looking at the supply of labor, it's anything that leads to the production of workers, right? So that could be people's education, that could be the population, and alternative jobs, right? So if we're looking at education to start out with, right? So over the pandemic, they kind of laxed a little bit on teacher education and what was required, right? Not a lot of people wanted to teach at the time, so they said, okay, instead of going through to get a 4-year degree, if you do 2 years and are in the process of finishing the other 2 years, you could go ahead and start teaching. So they required less education, the supply of teachers shifted to the right, it increased. Same thing for population, right? That as Brunswick's population's grown over the last decade, our supply of workers has increased. But since, Darien's kind of shrunk over the last decade, their population or their supply of workers has decreased. And the availability of jobs, right? That if we're looking at the supply of teachers, but there's other higher paying jobs around us, the supply of teachers is going to decline as people go to these alternative, jobs instead. All right, so here it's saying, if the equilibrium wage for electricians is $15, so we'll call this $15, and the government establishes a minimum wage of $10 an hour, what would happen to the wage and the quantity? All right, so in this case, if we're looking at a minimum wage, that would be an example of a price floor. Businesses can't pay those workers less than $10 an hour. So I'm going to put that right here. So I'm going to put MW for minimum wage. Now, if we're looking at how that's going to affect the quantity and the wages of the workers, my argument would be that it's not. Right now our minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, but if McDonald's starts at 10, that minimum wage doesn't really do us any good. If we want a minimum wage to do something, we'd have to raise it above that equilibrium at $12, $13, $14. Then it would be effective. But for this price floor to be below equilibrium, it doesn't really do anything, because that price floor prevents us from going any lower. But if we tell businesses don't pay less than 10, they're going to shrug their shoulders and keep paying at 15. Right? Same thing for McDonald's. They know they can't get away with paying people $7.25 anymore. It's not a livable wage. So if we set this price floor at $10, no effect. All right, and finally for 6, draw the results of a minimum wage, label quantity, supply, and demand. We've got our wages and quantity, we've got our supply and demand, we've got our equilibrium wage, WE, and our quantity of labor, QE. So if we're looking at a minimum wage, it would need to be above the equilibrium. Right? I'm going to put MW for minimum wage right there. So the effect of that, if we're looking at our quantity supplied and quantity demanded, now that is going to have an impact, because businesses want to pay their workers less, but they can't get down to that equilibrium. So our quantity supplied of workers is going to be up here. This will be QS. And our quantity demanded for workers is going to be over here, QD. Now, if we're looking at the effect of this, if our supply is greater than our demand, that's going to lead to a surplus of workers. And what that would translate to is unemployment, right? That the higher we raise that minimum wage, the more people are willing to work, but the less businesses are willing to hire workers. So by raising minimum wage too much, it can have an impact on unemployment. If we're looking at these on the side here, let's just kind of walk through these together. So these are just looking at some of the shifters. If the demand for houses increases, the wages for carpenters will do what? So if the demand for houses go up, the demand for carpenters are going to go up. So we'll just shift it right here. All right, we can see that the wages of carpenters will increase compared to before. And the quantity is going to increase as well, right? So our demand for these workers go up, wages are going up, quantity is going up. Assume that bricks and wood are substitute resources. If the price of bricks increases, the price of wood would do what? All right, so if these are, this is no different than the product market we were looking at before. So if the price of bricks increase, fewer people are going to buy the bricks, more people are going to buy the wood. The demand for the wood is going to go up. If the demand for it goes up, same thing with the product market, demand goes up, prices are going to go up and quantity is going to go up as well. If the government removes all regulations from becoming a dentist, I think that would affect the supply of dentists. Now it's easier to become a dentist, so our supply curve shifts to the right. If more people are doing it, our quantity is increased. If more people are doing it, I think that would lower the wages, right? Our equilibrium wage would go down. So the wages for dentists would go down, but it would be easier to become a dentist, so the quantity would go up. If the demand for accountants fall at the same time the supply increases, this would be one of our double shifters again. So we've got price and quantity, we've got our supply and got our demand. The demand for accountants goes down. At the same time, the demand is going down at the same time that the supply is increasing. So we've got our old equilibrium here and our new equilibrium here. All right, when demand went down, the quantity dropped. When the supply increased, the quantity went back up. So if we're looking at the effect here, the wages for sure have gone down. But the quantity itself, again, we would call that indeterminate. That doesn't mean it didn't change, we just can't determine how much it changed. It increased and it decreased. So it's more or less where it was before, maybe it changed a little bit, but not by a lot. And then finally for 11, will a binding minimum wage lead to relatively less unemployment when the demand for labor is inelastic or elastic? I thought this one was tricky, so ignore this for a second. All right, now let's look at wages and quantity. We've got our demand curve. Let's say that we're looking at inelastic demand, right? No matter what the wage is, we still need these workers. Think of like doctors there. And then we've got our supply of labor here. All right, so if we were to set a binding minimum wage, a price floor, that would have to be above equilibrium. So minimum wage here. All right. Will a binding minimum wage lead to a relatively less unemployment when the demand for labor is inelastic or elastic? So if it's inelastic, we're still going to hire those workers. Even if we raise the wages of them, the quantity isn't changing. So if our demand is inelastic, again, remember it's vertical. No matter whether it's $10 an hour, 15, 20, 30, we're still hiring the same number of workers there. So if we raise that minimum wage, unemployment's not really going to change. So think of it this way. If we raised our minimum wage to $25 an hour, that's above most markets, right? The demand for people flipping burgers is probably going to go down. The demand for nurses probably isn't going to change. We still need them even if we're paying them at a higher price. But I think that's the last part. No, we'll do the second half of Unit 5 in just a minute.